Hello and welcome to the Underappreciated Animals podcast with Hatchling Makes, an animal-themed podcast filled with fun facts about species which aren't always the main feature in nature documentaries but are getting a chance in the spotlight because they are amazing and they deserve some attention too. My name is Tash and I am a wildlife artist and lifelong animal lover. I run a small business called Hatchling Makes where I sell wildlife-inspired enamel pins and stickers, and every sale helps to raise money for wildlife conservation. In each episode of this show, I will be chatting about a different underappreciated animal, from horseshoe crabs to cassowaries to rock hyraxes and everything in between. I'll be sharing fun facts and telling you all about these incredible species, from where they're found to what they eat to just what makes them so special. Before we go any further, I do want to add in a tiny disclaimer. I am not a wildlife professional in any way, shape, or form. I am just an extreme animal lover, but I will do my very best to research these creatures to the best of my abilities so I can bring you their stories as accurately as possible. So without further ado, let's dive on into today's episode. Hello friends, and welcome back to the Underappreciated Animals podcast. Thank you so much for tuning back in, or if you're a new listener, then thank you so much for choosing to listen. You can totally listen to these episodes out of order. There's no storyline or anything like that you need to follow, so don't worry, you can always go back and listen in any order that you like. Now, officially, this is episode 2 of the Underappreciated Animals podcast, and for this episode, we're going to be focusing on one of my childhood favorite animals, which is the wombat. Most of my family live in Australia, and they have been there ever since I was a child, so I have been travelling back and forth there my whole life, and so I have a lot of love for Australian animals because I was basically brought up on them. And there's something about wombats that's always just been so appealing to me. I actually had a wombat plush toy when I was about 7 or 8, and I still have it somewhere. It's safely tucked away in storage, so I'm really excited to share some fun wombat facts with you all. If this is your first time listening to this podcast and you're wondering what to expect, I will be chatting all about these incredible animals. Where you can find them, what do they eat, why is a wombat's poo cube-shaped? All of the important questions. So let's get started. There are actually 3 different wombat species. There is the northern hairy-nosed wombat, found in the north of Australia, and funnily enough it has a hairy nose. Then there is the bare-nosed wombat, which is also known as the common wombat and is found in the southeast. And finally, the southern hairy-nosed wombat, found, ironically enough, in the south of Australia. I mean, they really thought long and hard when they decided to differentiate the species, right? It's found in the north. Let's call it the northern hairy-nosed wombat. Now, wombats are one of those Australian-specific species. Their closest relative is the koala, so you're just not going to find them anywhere else in the world. They're just in Australia. But, unlike other Australian animals, it won't kill you. Or will it? Gotta listen to the rest of the episode to find out. Now, for the sake of this episode, I will be talking about all wombats in general, but if there's anything specific about a particular species, I'll make sure to point that out. I will also be referring to the bare-nosed wombat as the common wombat, just because otherwise there's 3 wombat species, all with nose in the name, and if you know me in real life, you'll know I'll end up tripping over my own words, and sometimes it's hard enough to read my notes as it is. Now, wombats are adorable. They are basically big furry rocks. And I really do mean big. I will get to that in just a second, but the 3 species do have their differences when it comes to looks, other than the obvious ones, which is that the hairy-nosed species have hairy noses. The common wombat is sort of a classic-looking wombat. It's got a sloping body and the head close to the ground and the oval-shaped nose. It's the iconic wombat. It's the wombat which is on all the wombat merch. It is so cute. In comparison, both the hairy-nosed species, which are still cute, have a slightly longer snout, which always makes them have like a slightly canine look to them. Common wombats also have a slightly more rounded ear shape, whereas the hairy-nosed ones have a bit more of a pointed ear. And I think that pointed ear is what makes me think of canines when I look at them, because it does look a little bit like a dog from the side. And that's really the main way that you can tell the common wombat apart from the hairy-nosed species, but all 3 of them are pretty similar otherwise. They have really stocky little bodies and really powerful looking front legs. They are a burrowing species, and you can just kind of tell that when you look at them. If you're new to this podcast and like me, you prefer a more visual reference of what a wombat looks like, I have drawn one for the artwork of this episode, so you can reference that if you'd like. I've drawn the faces of a common wombat and a northern hairy-nosed wombat side by side so you can see the comparisons. So back to their size, and again, these are big animals. I remember coming across a wild wombat once on a holiday with family, and I was really surprised at just how big they were. The northern hairy-nosed wombat is actually one of the world's largest burrowing mammals. These buddies can be up to 1 meter long and 30 kg. For listeners who use inches and pounds as measurements, we are talking about 40 inches long and 68 pounds here. Common and southern hairy-nosed wombats come in a little smaller than that, but there was some discrepancies in this when I was researching for this episode, and there's a lot of different numbers floating around, so for transparency's sake, I am going off data here from the National Geographic and the Australian Wildlife Conservancy. Now, their size is nothing compared to their ancestors from the Pleistocene era. Back then, giant wombats would roam across southern Australia, and they were called diprotodon. And they were what is known as a mega herbivore. They were just shy of 2 meters tall. So mega is really the right word for it. They were about the same height as a modern-day rhino. Now, I don't know about you, but herbivore or not, that's a really big animal. Modern-day wombats, in comparison, come in at a much more reasonable 80 centimeters tall. Now, I was looking for something to compare that to, and apparently that is about half the height of Danny DeVito. Or about the height of 2 bowling pins stacked on top of each other. Now, we touched a little bit about where the 3 different species are found earlier on in the episode, but I'm going to get a little more specific here because the different species do occupy different habitats as well. So, northern hairy-nosed wombats are found in the Australian state of Queensland, which is on the east coast. Common wombats are found in southern Queensland, also New South Wales, Victoria and Tasmania. So that's stretching from the east down to south and then a little bit along the bottom of Australia. And southern hairy-nosed wombats are found in Western Australia, South Australia and New South Wales. So there's a little overlap in some species, especially in their historical distribution, but nowadays the populations are a little more isolated. Wombats are really adaptable and live in a range of habitats, but generally speaking, the common wombat is found mostly in eucalyptus forests, in the mountains, and by the coast, whereas the hairy-nosed species tend to prefer slightly more open and spacious grasslands. When I saw wombat, it was actually at the entrance to its burrow on farmland near the coast and near a small temperate forest, which must have been part of its territory. So I mentioned a burrow, and wombats are burrowing marsupials, and they build massive, and I really do mean that, massive burrows. I feel like it's really hard to explain the scale of a wombat burrow until you see one in person, but as an 8 or 9-year-old, slightly lanky kid, my sister could have crawled into the wombat burrow that we saw. Some wombat burrows have been known to be up to 30 meters long. And whilst common wombats are generally solitary, the hairy-nosed wombats have been known to live in larger colonies, so I guess that calls for a larger burrow. Burrows can have multiple entrances and exits and different rooms, and wombats use them to escape from predators, but also just to escape from the heat of the day. Which, as someone who has experienced an Australian summer, let me tell you, I would absolutely escape from the heat of the day in a wombat burrow if you gave me half a chance. And, of course, these burrows are incredibly useful for other creatures too, particularly during bushfire season, when other animals like rock wallabies or bettongs have been known to use wombat burrows. And they do this because the burrows are cooler, obviously being inside the earth, and so that protects them from the fires, and the fire passes over them, and then they're unharmed. I'm going to sidetrack here just because I'm expecting someone to ask me what a bettong is, and a bettong is a type of kangaroo. It's also known as a rat kangaroo. So you heard me say earlier that wombats are a marsupial, which is essentially just a fancy way of saying that they are a mammal which rears babies in a pouch. So the difference between a mammal and a marsupial is that a mammal gives birth to a baby which is fully developed. A marsupial will have essentially a premature birth, and then the baby will climb into the pouch and continue to develop before then coming out into the world. I'm really stripping that back to basics there, so please don't come after me and be like, this is not what it means. Essentially, this is what it means. Now, if you are after a super cute fun fact, wombat babies are known as joeys, just like kangaroos. I just think that's really cute. So, let's talk about poo. That's a phrase I never thought I would say on my podcast, but here we are. Probably the most well-known fact about wombats is that their poo is shaped like a cube, and it's been a mystery as to how or why they do this, but it seems to have been finally solved, so I'm going to tell you all about it. So, in 2018, it was discovered that wombat intestines are really elastic. They sort of expand and contract several times over, and that's what forms the shape of the cube, and this happens right at the end of the digestive process. I think one of the phrases I read was something along the lines of, so you can fit a square peg into a round hole. Now, just like with other animals, their poo is really important, especially for captive wombats. Keepers and vets can use their poo to get a sort of snapshot into the health of the individual, and sometimes wombats who are in captivity, their poo isn't as cube-shaped as their wild counterparts. So shape is really important here. I'm just going to sidetrack here for a second and say that I spent a long time, more time than I thought I would, reading up on wombat poo. Anyone who ever looks at my internet search history, whew, good luck. Moving on. So wombats poo a lot. Common wombats can poo up to 100 little cubes a day. Now, I read a couple of different articles on wombat poo, and some of them said that the wombats collect their poo and then place it around their territory, and some of them said that they will go to the edge of the territory and go poo there. But the general thought is that they use their poo to communicate with each other, kind of like scent marking. And they also use their poo to mark the edges of their territory because wombats are territorial little critters. It's also sort of agreed that the reason wombat poo is cube-shaped is so that it can't roll away. So once it's placed on the log or the rock, then it's not going to roll off. And as a wombat, I guess you don't want your poo to roll into someone else's territory, so I guess that's why they evolved in that way. And that is all my facts about wombat poo. Now, this next fact here is probably one of my personal favorite and lesser known of the wombat facts, and that is that they can be really fast when they want to be. They can run up to 40 kilometers an hour. Imagine a little furry rocket pelting towards you at that speed. They are more sprint runners than they are marathon runners, so they will only run in short bursts, but it is so adorable to see, and if you want a cute boost of serotonin today, then after this episode, go look up wombat running videos. You will not be disappointed. Now, before you go and start trying to cuddle wild wombats, they can be aggressive, so do be careful. If you are lucky enough to see one, I would give it a wide berth. Observe from a distance. Attacks on humans are rare, but they do happen. Now, they're not going to suddenly just decide they don't like you and bite you, but they are territorial, and so if they feel threatened, they will try to protect themselves and their territory. So it's definitely something you want to keep in mind if you are going bushwalking and entering their habitat. Wombats are nocturnal, so the chances of encountering one in the wild are slim anyways, but just use your common sense. Actually, if you go to Australia, that's just sort of true for all the flora and fauna there. Another fun fact about wombats is that their teeth continue to grow throughout their life. They eat grasses and leaves and stalks and even like to snack on some tree bark, which obviously wears down their teeth. So their teeth continue to grow, and that helps them to compensate for chomping on those really tough fibers. That was a lot of wombat info in a very short amount of time. Again, I love wombats. I think they're so cute, but there's definitely more to them than meets the eye. So before I wrap up this episode, I'm just going to chat about conservation and threats to wombats, because the southern hairy-nosed wombat is endangered and the northern hairy-nosed wombat is critically endangered. So the Queensland government is actively trying to help conserve the northern population and set up new populations along with the Australian Wildlife Conservancy. Population levels of the northern hairy-nosed wombat actually dropped to just 35 individuals at one point, but thanks to conservation efforts, those numbers are now up to around 300, which is incredible. And that's all thanks to them taking precautions like installing a dingo-proof fence around one of the populations to keep them safe. In addition to predation from dingoes and invasive species like wild dogs, all wombats are currently losing their habitat to make way for farmland and ranches. Wombats were actually considered a pest for a really long time, so sadly they were hunted. And common wombats are still considered to be vermin by some farmers, and they're blamed for damages to fencing, and also for creek and soil erosion because their burrows altered the landscape. In 2020, the Australian state of Victoria actually closed a legal loophole, which means that hunting for wombats is now illegal, and all wombats are now protected across Australia, which is amazing news. So lots of great news there for wombats, and I think on that note, we are going to wrap this episode up here. Thank you so much for tuning in today, folks, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and until next time, take care. Thank you so much for listening to the Underappreciated Animals podcast. I hope you found this episode fun and interesting, and if you did, then please reach out, let me know. I would love to hear from you. If you love animals and you would like to help support this podcast, you can check out my website for my small business, Hatchling Makes, which you can find at hatchlingmakes.com, or if you head to the show notes, I'll leave a link there. It's got wildlife-inspired enamel pins and stickers and stationery and all that good stuff. Plus 10% of every sale is donated to wildlife conservation. Also, if you have a moment to leave me a review, I would be super grateful. That really helps me to know that I am sharing the animal stories that you want to hear. You can also discover more underappreciated animals by listening to the other episodes, which are available wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe whilst you're there so you don't miss out on any future episodes. New episodes will come out every other week on a Friday. I'm also taking animal suggestions, so hop on over into the show notes to find out how to do that if you have an animal you'd like me to highlight on the show. Bonus points if you mention one that I have never heard of before. That's all from me. Until next time, take care, folks.